Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to this second learning session on community development and social housing with Rosie Gallen. Called David Sussman Tokuinua. I work with Community Housing Aotearoa and we're your hosts today. We're a peak body for community housing providers across New Zealand. I'll begin and open our meeting with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta. He mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura. He tia, he tio, he huka, he hohu, ti he moriora. So, yes, kia ora again. Welcome on behalf of Rosie and ourselves at Community Housing Aotearoa. Yeah, great to have you joining us at this kind of lunchtime session. Hope you're staying warm. So this is the second session, and we have Rosie Gallen here with us today, and it's going to talk to us. I'm just reading the title: How Community Development Holds Systems Together and Where Pressure Builds. So looking forward to that. So a quick introduction to Rosie, very brief one. Her accomplishments are much bigger than this, but Rosie is a community development and engagement practitioner with over 20 years experience working at the interface between government and with communities affected by change. Her philosophy is that people and communities have a right to have a say on issues that affect them. I agree with that, and is committed to keeping them central to any decision-making process. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Rosie.
Okay, well, kia ora everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. We had a good session last week when we talked about community development and public housing, and this one is about the housing system, if you like. So I've called it From the Margins to the Core. So anyway, welcome back for those who attended last week, and welcome to newbies. So in the first one, I focused on what community development is doing in public housing, and focused on the activities and the outcomes that it achieves, such as building trust, connection, voice, belonging, and the relational work that often sits beneath the formal job titles. Today, I want to shift the focus. This session asks a harder question. What does community development reveal about the housing system it operates inside? So the focus today is not just the practice, it's the pressure around the practice. The title From the Margins to the Core reflects the central argument that community development and relational work are often treated as marginal, as peripheral, but the research suggests, my research, suggests they're much closer to the core of how public systems actually function. So this is based on my doctoral research, and without further ado, David, let's move on to the slide 2. So this is the argument that sets up the session. When harm occurs in public housing systems, it's not always the result of one bad decision or one poor staff member or a failed process. It's actually produced through ordinary systems that are designed around risk, performance, asset delivery, compliance, and throughput. Those things matter. But public housing organisations need accountability, safety, and good asset management. That's a given. But when relationships are not designed into the system, the human and relational consequences can become hidden. So I delivered a paper in Sheffield called The Hidden Harm of Housing Systems. So I'm going to incorporate that in this session. So the question is, what happens when systems designed around assets and risk are expected to deliver trust, care, participation, and well-being? So slide 3, thank you. So slide 3, this one is called From Webinar 1 to Webinar 2. So it's sort of a bridge to it, if you like. So just to recap from last time, my research covered 25 qualitative interviews with housing professionals across 2 local authorities, Housing New Zealand and Kainga Ora. And the research covers 2 time periods, 2000 to 2011 and 2019 to 2023. So the last session we focused on was community development as practice. We looked at what it is, what it does, and how the same relational function can sit underneath different job titles and organisational language. Today we're stepping back. We're asking, what kind of system is this working? Is this work operating inside? And what is the system asking relational work to carry? So slide 4, thanks, David. So the core argument here is community development does not only support tenants and communities, it also reveals where housing systems are fragmented, unstable, or too thinly designed to hold trust, care, and participation. It's important because community development often shows us the gap between what organisations say they value and what their systems are actually designed to support. If trust depends on individual practitioners, then that tells us something about the system. If participation only works when someone informally holds the process together, then that tells us about the system. If care is expected but not resourced, then that tells us something about the system. Next slide, thank you. So I just wanted to talk about the 3 pressures that shape the system. And I want to name them. The first is residualisation. So that's a very, only housing people use that word actually, I think. So public housing over time has become a targeted safety net. I call it social housing as triage. And it's for households with high and complex needs rather than the broader social infrastructure. So it concentrates disadvantage and embeds scarcity into institutional design. The second one is policy volatility. So this is about what happens when the electoral cycle changes, when the pendulum swings to and fro, directions change and programs start and stop, priorities shift, and communities remember this. Practitioners remember this. Organisations lose continuity and institutional memory. And third is contested purpose. So this is confusion or perhaps disagreement about what public housing is for. Is it an asset portfolio? Is it a residual welfare function? Is it a benefit? Or is it social infrastructure that contributes to community wellbeing? Community development operates inside all these 3 pressures, and that matters because relational work is not only happening on a calm lake, it's happening in the weather. Next slide, please. So this is the contested purpose problem, and this is from one of my key informants. So this is a result of a policy change where it had gone from being, I guess, more inclusive of community activity and responsiveness to tenant needs. It switched to, we're just a landlord, that's all we do, we just rent houses. So I use this because it captures a live tension in public housing. If public housing is only understood as a landlord function, then community development can look like an optional extra, and often are terms used, not core service. It's not core service. It's not part of the core services that housing is supposed to deliver. However, if public housing is understood as social infrastructure, then community development becomes part of how the organisation sustains trust, participation, connection and wellbeing. So this is a contested purpose problem. Where purpose remains unsettled and people don't agree or have quite different worldviews about what that means, then organisational change can produce rupture rather than evolution. So people are not just adjusting to a new program, they're actually adjusting to a shifting institutional identity. Next slide, please. So what does the structural pressure produce? So these structural pressures produce a particular operating environment. There's often a mandate mismatch. Wellbeing language sits on top of systems still organised around throughput, risk, compliance, and capital delivery. So there are high expectations and low clarity. So they're asked to support community wellbeing, but often without clear leadership, stable mandate, or integrated systems. And relational work becomes marginalised because it has to continually justify itself in the frameworks that privilege measurable outcomes over long-term trust. Cultural work is often assumed rather than supported. Māori and Pasifika models of care may be relied on, but not always resourced, protected, or recognised. So the issue is not that organisations don't have good intent, it's that the intent is often layered onto systems that are not designed to carry it. Next slide, please, slide 8. So this I've called a typology of harm. So this typology came from trying to name what practitioners were describing as they carried out their role. It's not it's not abstract theory for the sake of theory. It's a way of seeing how harm travels through systems. So I start with structural harm. It's instability built into policy, mandate, funding, and institutional design. So systemic harm is harm generated through ordinary processes working as they were designed. And moral harm is the ethical strain practitioners experience when they know what care requires but cannot fully act on it. These forms of harm stack up. They structural instability intensifies the systemic defensiveness. Systemic defensiveness creates relational consequences. Those consequences are often absorbed by practitioners and tenants, and that's the movement I want to trace. So thanks, David. Next slide. So I'm talking about structural harm in practice. This quote captures the impact of policy churn. So this is a housing professional who talked about a change of government. And when I asked, how did the community respond to know that your program's been canned? And they responded, the community had seen it all before, and it was, here we go again. So this is what volatility does. It erodes institutional memory. That housing practitioner will most likely leave. It weakens trust. If that's where communities say, here we go again, that's a really good sign of, it's just another piece of the puzzle or the cycle or whatever. It's being done to us again. We didn't have a say about this. It teaches communities not to invest too much in the relationship because the program will disappear, staff will change, and the direction will reverse. So structural harm is not always visible as one dramatic event. It can be the slow erosion of confidence that anything will last. Trust built up over many years can be undone by one single reversal. And once communities have been through enough of this, investment and retreat, skepticism becomes very rational. Next slide, please. I'm talking about systemic harm in practice. So this is one of the sharpest points. The process worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. So that was a real hit in Sheffield. One of the people who saw my presentation thought that's exactly what they experienced there. The process was built into the design. The harm was built into the design, and that was the problem. So sometimes harm, it doesn't come from a broken process. It comes from a process that does what it was designed to do. But it's not designed around human well-being or consequences. So the rules are applied consistently and timelines are followed. Redevelopment proceeds according to plan, to the timeline, but tenants are left with uncertainty, anxiety, confusion, and loss of control. So this quote makes it clear. So people weren't upset about moving. They were upset about not knowing what was happening to their lives. And that's not a communication issue. It's a relational consequence of how the system operates. So next slide, please. This one is talking about moral harm in practice. So this moves from the system to the practitioner. So the following quote is going to be a bit tough because it captures the ethical constraint. You're dealing with people's homes, their security, and you can't even be honest with them because the system doesn't back you up. So what I, in my thesis, try to explain that this is different than burnout. Burnout's often about exhaustion, overload, or prolonged stress. Moral harm is different. It happens when practitioners know what a humane response requires, but the system prevents or constrains that response. They may want to be honest, but can't. They may want to offer certainty, but do not have it. They may want to follow through, but the system shifts. So the harm is not personal failure, it's ethical strain produced by institutional design. So slide 12, please. So where does the cost land? So this slide shows the pathway. At the top are system pressures, policy volatility, fragmentation, compliance, redevelopment timelines. And those pressures produce relational consequences, uncertainty, mistrust, anxiety, confusion, disengagement. And then the question is who absorbs it? Often it's tenants, communities, and practitioners. Tenants absorb the uncertainty, communities absorb the disruption, but the practitioners absorb the ethical and relational weight of trying to keep trust alive in systems that keep undermining it. So the point is systems do not always resolve harm. Sometimes they redistribute it. That redistribution is often hidden, hence the name hidden harm. Next slide, please, David. So this is proposition 3. So I dealt with the 2 propositions last week. This is proposition 3, reframing care as duty. Care in public housing can't depend on only individual goodwill. It matters that practitioner care, of course it does, but if the system relies on trust, continuity, participation and well-being, then care cannot remain informal, discretionary or personality dependent on the margins. It has to become part of the institutional responsibility. So that means shifting from caring practitioners to caring systems. So not sentimental systems, not vague kindness, but systems designed to support dignity, relational accountability, continuity and trust. So just the next slide is relational work in the gap. So this slide names what relational work does when formal structures are too thin. So practitioners translate institutional decisions into humanly intelligible terms. They rebuild trust after disruption, and they maintain continuity across program changes, staff changes, and policy changes. They notice early what formal systems are too distant or too slow to see. This is not supplementary work. This is actually how the system keeps functioning when the formal architecture does not hold enough trust, care, or continuity. The phrase I use in the paper is compensatory governance. In plainer terms, relational work becomes the patch, the bridge, and sometimes the shock absorber. Can I have the next slide, please? This one is talking about the stabilising effect and its cost. So I'm just going to quote one of my key informants. The doing part, actually helping the people, that was easy. Navigating the organisation at times, that was a lot harder. So this quote matters because it separates the relational work from the organisational strain. And that's an important distinction. The difficult part was not necessarily the community, it was the institutional environment around the work. So relational work can stabilise systems, it can reduce conflict, rebuild trust, keep communication open and prevent disengagement, but there's a cost, particularly when the work remains invisible in governance frameworks. It can mask the instability underneath. The system looks more humane than it structurally is because people are quietly absorbing the relational costs. Next slide, please. So this is about relational work or relational burden. And this is the line we need to draw. There is relational work that's supported, named, resourced, recognised and protected. And there's relational work that becomes load-bearing, expected to compensate for system failure, carried alone, invisible in governance and depleted when staff leave or programs end. The first is healthy and necessary, and the second is risky. The research shows what happens when that line gets crossed. Community development shouldn't become the place where organisations park every relational problem they have, not designed for themselves to address. So this is not relational practice, it's a relational burden. Next slide, please. I'm making here, it's important that I make a structural argument. It's not a critique of individuals. The practitioners in this research were doing significant work in difficult conditions, and they cared and they showed up and they adapted and they held relationships together. And the question is not whether they cared enough. The question is whether institutions are designed to sustain the work they rely on. Because if this system depends on relational labour but does not recognise, resource or protect it, then it will just burn through people. And eventually it burns through trust. So this slide is talking about 3 stabilising conditions for housing governance. So I guess I want to propose a different way of looking at things and propose changes that may prevent the harm that I've just talked about. The first is a durable institutional purpose. I believe that public housing and social housing needs stable enough purpose to embed relational commitments across political and organisational cycles. The second is relational accountability. Trust, continuity, dignity, and tenant experience needs to sit alongside compliance metrics and not instead of them, but alongside them. The third one is organisational coherence. So redevelopment, tenancy management, asset planning, community-facing functions need to be better connected, so responsibility for the tenant experience is owned rather than diffused. So together these conditions towards public housing as social infrastructure, not just as housing stock, but housing as part of the fabric of community life. So the next slide, please. So this is a broader reframing. Public housing is not just an asset portfolio. It's not just a residual welfare function. It's social infrastructure. So it means that it shapes the relational conditions of everyday life: stability, connection, safety, dignity, participation, and belonging. So I hope it's just not a nice phrase, that it has operational implications. It changes what organisations measure, how they lead, how they design roles, how they manage redevelopment, how they listen, and how they hold responsibility for the tenant experience. If public housing is social infrastructure, relationships are not peripheral, they're not out on the margins, they're part of the infrastructure. So next slide, please. So moving to the core requires moving from the margins to the core, and it requires 5 things. First of all, it names the work clearly and consistently. Second, it resources it through stable roles, protected time, and infrastructure. Third, protecting it across cycles of leadership, policy, and organisational change. Fourth, measuring it in ways that can hold relational contribution alongside outputs. And fifth, leading it through cultures that treat relational work as fundamental to public service, not as a soft extra. So this is what institutional responsibility looks like in practice. So it's not an applause for good practitioners, it's design that sustains the work. So this is, next slide, please, David. Yeah. It's a moment to reflect, and I just want to pause and invite you to think about your own organisation. Where is relational work quietly compensating for structural conditions? Where are people translating, smoothing, explaining, repairing, reconnecting, or holding trust together? And is that work visible in how it's resourced, recognised, or led? So this isn't about attributing blame, it's about organisational honesty, because what remains invisible usually remains unsupported. So next slide, please. So across both of the webinars, there are three takeaways. First, community development creates the conditions for participation, trust, connection, voice, and belonging. These are not produced by process alone. Second, practitioners carry relational knowledge that systems depend on. They notice what formal structures miss. They translate between institutions and communities. They hold continuity across disruption. And third, care must become institutional responsibility, not individual goodwill. So this means that care needs to be named, resourced, protected, and embedded in how organisations are designed and held accountable. So next slide, please. So my closing argument. So community development should not be the place where housing systems hide their relational deficits. It should be part of how public housing becomes more accountable, humane, and connected. That is the shift from the margins to the core, not because community development can fix everything, but because it reveals something that housing systems need to take seriously, that trust, care, participation, and continuity are not soft extras, and they are part of what makes public housing work.
Thank you for everyone who joined us
Yeah,
today.
thank you so much.
That's okay. And Genevieve, thank you for helping in the background and making sure everything runs smoothly. I've got a little poem for you. It's one of my old favorites from a book called More Than a Roof, Housing in Poems and Prose, where the Lanyon Press went out and got all sorts of poems from different people. But this one's called All Sorts by Stella Carruthers. The metal teeth of the escalators nibble on the hem of my frayed jeans and pleather moccasin boots. Hidden behind the foreign newspapers, we knit and purl, drink black tea, and eat strata-leveled sweets. We invite the guy hanging by the food trolley to sit down. He speaks of working on boats in the south, how that was where he learned to work delicately with his hands and to tie such beautiful knots. He tells us of living on the street, and we teach him how to cast on and make the beginnings of stitches, show him that seams can come together no matter how rough around the edges.
That's lovely.
That's an old favourite of mine. Some of you might have heard it before. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. I'll be in
Yep.
touch.
Thank you.